Library. I'm very happy that you're joining us for this MyLibraryU fast class with one of my favorite people, which is Dr. David Anderson. That's you. Dr. David Anderson is from the University of Louisville's Department of English. And before I introduce him, I just wanted to call your attention to the fact that you can earn points for, by watching this tonight for our Books and Brews 502 Adult Winter Reading Program. It's like summer reading for kids, but it's winter reading for adults. And you can earn points by reading and attending programs like this. You can see all the details about that on our website and look at www.lfpl/booksandbrews. And you can make sure that you log this class while you're there. And then again, you earn some points and you might win some prizes. Today's fast class is the latest in a long list of MyLibraryU programs, some of which you can revisit by going to our YouTube channel and checking out the Author Talks playlist there. So again, that's just look for Louisville Free Public Library on YouTube and you'll find us. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. David Anderson. Hello, David. Dr. Anderson earned his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and has been teaching at the Department of English at the University of Louisville since 1993. His interests are many and include neglected African-American poetry at the turn of the 19th and early 20th centuries, especially the work of Louisville poet and author George Marion McClellan. He also works in environmentalism and eco-fiction, poetic forms and traditions, and tonight's topic, the Harlem Renaissance. He has taught countless classes on African-American literature and is currently finishing up his latest book, I Will Take to the Water, an anthology of African-Americans and the sea. Everyone, welcome Dr. Anderson.
Well, hi everybody, and it's a real honor to be here and to be introduced by Tracy Haichu, who used to work at the University of Louisville and did yeoman's work for the humanities program. I mean, for really everybody and in many different things. So it's wonderful to be reconnected with her. So tonight, what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about the Harlem Renaissance, more from a literature perspective, but I will mention some art as well and a little bit of music as we go along. It'll be really quick, a sort of general introduction. It's one of my favorite historical or really cultural movements in the 20th century, and it really connects with what was happening in the teens and 20s, a series of dramatic cultural changes and social changes. And the Harlem Renaissance is an artistic movement that really captured a lot of these changes and made a great deal of difference. Literature and music after the Harlem Renaissance happened to be markedly different. The trajectory of African-American writing changed markedly from the 1920s until today. And so, so let me get started. I will kind of describe the Harlem Renaissance. I'll share my screen periodically and then stop sharing it, when it gets very, very dull, but nevertheless. So what I wanted to mention briefly is, sometimes the Harlem Renaissance is also known as the New Negro Renaissance. And that in fact was what it was considered at the time in the 1920s. Various figures like Alain Locke, Howard University philosophy professor, who was a significant figure in that Renaissance, called it the New Negro Renaissance. And of course, a lot of people talked about the New Negro. One of the things that's very important is a sort of binary or split between an artificial or conceived old Negro or a past historical figure, a past social figure, and a new day and a new person, a new psychology in Black America that was arriving in the 1920s. And so one of the things that's very dominant when we talk about the New Negro Renaissance or the Harlem Renaissance, it's a movement, cultural movement that's consciously moving away from the past and moving into modernity. It's the conception of a modern African American, ready for the modern age and ready to basically strive for civil rights, strive for greater opportunities, develop a new cultural voice that expresses both a historical pride, a racial pride in identity, and a new kind of assertiveness in searching for, again, social equality. The Harlem Renaissance, or the New Negro Renaissance, is the first significant literary and arts movement among African Americans. This isn't to say that there hadn't been prior writing, that there hadn't been prior art, visual art, prior music. Of course, there had been, but in many ways, this was what the historian David Levering Lewis has called a manufactured arts movement. That is, not only did you have a lot of artistic activity going on, but you had figures in New York City who were eager to not only bring artists, writers to New York City, but to in many ways get them published, get their work in galleries, get them connected to various artistic patrons. It was a time in which various race leaders were very concerned about the image of African Americans, which was largely dominated by minstrelsy, stereotypes, and so on and so forth. So this was the attempt to create an arts movement that would put out competing images of Black people in their inner lives as well as their social lives to combat the kinds of dominant stereotypes that were prevalent in the media. It's important for a couple of ways, and I'll kind of stop sharing, but I'll look at my own screen. It's important for a couple of reasons. It not only marks an important psychological and cultural change that's taking place with the amount of art that is being produced, for instance, in literature at that time. Up until the 1930s, the majority of literature that had been written by African Americans was autobiographical and often connected to the slave narrative. It's really with the 1920s and the 1930s that you shift to a large number of novels, books of poetry, a drama, et cetera, a shift away from nonfiction to creative writing, other kinds of creative writing. And the Harlem Renaissance, or New Negro Renaissance, is very important because it influences later artistic production. You really can't imagine, for instance, Richard Wright and his writing in Chicago in the 1930s, 1940s, even though he tries to distance himself from the Harlem Renaissance. You really can't imagine that without the Harlem Renaissance, at least offering at least one set of ideals of what Black literature, Black art could be. Langston Hughes, for instance, who is one of the dominant figures of the Harlem Renaissance, is going to be active for 4 decades and influence 2 generations of Black writers. Younger participants, Zora Neale Hurston was actually older. In many ways, she publishes short fiction in the 20s, and she publishes several books, including Their Eyes Were Watching God, her ethnographic writings in the 1930s. You can't imagine the Black arts movement, which also is kind of looking to the Harlem Renaissance. The Black arts movement being the great arts movement tied to the Black Power movement of the 1960s and the early 1970s. And also internationally, the Caribbean writers as well as African writers, when they begin to conceive of national literary traditions, they turn to the Harlem Renaissance and they study, how does Langston Hughes represent popular culture? How does he represent daily life in the big city? How does he represent, in other words, these other literary movements later on in the 20th century are very much influenced by the Harlem Renaissance. And in fact, the Harlem Renaissance itself, despite the name, is an international movement. These writers traveled internationally. They translated writings of the African diaspora into English, and they in turn were translated in multiple languages around the world. You had very prominent artists like Claude McKay, a very important Jamaican writer, active in New York, not so much the Harlem Renaissance itself, but an influence on the Harlem Renaissance. So the Harlem Renaissance is not simply local. It's not simply American. It is an arts movement that had a worldwide impact. Let me see if I can move on to the next one. Let me share my screen here for just a brief moment, if I can find it. Here we go. Share. I wanted to start primarily by offering two competing views of the Harlem Renaissance. One from the writer Alain Locke, basically a Harvard-trained Howard University professor, who was in many ways one of the leading figures, of, at least intellectual figures, in the Harlem Renaissance. And he wrote or edited a very important anthology called The New Negro. It's still in print, and it's still very important, in which Locke was basically trying to capture not only the spirit of the times and the kind of new psychology and assertiveness of Black America, but he also really felt that Harlem would be the cultural capital, not only of the United States, of Black America, but also the cultural capital of the entire Black diaspora. And in fact, he writes, in Harlem, Negro life is seizing upon its first chances from group expression and I'm losing I can't quite see, and self-determination. It is or promises at least to be a race capital. Harlem has the same role to play for the new Negro as Dublin has for the new Ireland or Prague for the new Czechoslovakia. So it's this great, wonderful, optimistic vision of not only what Harlem is, but what the Harlem Renaissance can be in terms of a cultural capital. And I just wanted to go to another vision offered after the Renaissance is over by Langston Hughes in his wonderful memoir, The Big C, from 1940. And he's much more ambivalent about the Harlem Renaissance and what it was. He says it was a period when every season there was at least one hit play on Broadway acted by a Negro cast, and when books by Negro authors were being published with much greater frequency and much more publicity than ever before or since in history. And I guess the since is the 1930s, which follows right afterwards. It was the period when the Negro was in vogue. And then he adds, the ordinary Negroes hadn't heard of the Negro Renaissance. And if they had, it hadn't raised their wages any. So what you have with these two different visions of the Harlem Renaissance is, on the one hand, the view of what Harlem and then what the Harlem Renaissance could be. That is, Harlem certainly wasn't the only city that was growing rapidly in terms of its Black population. This is occurring during what was known as the Great Migration, the first wave of Black migration out from the Deep South and out from rural agricultural areas to cities not only in the South, such as Atlanta and Birmingham, but in the North, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Chicago. And the reason for this out-migration was very simple. Well, I mean, it's a little bit complex. Both the sense of racial oppression and the lack of opportunity. You have to realize that in 1900, 90% of the Black population was Southern and 75% of it was rural. African Americans, far from moving forward after the end of slavery, because of year-long wageless contracts established by the Freedmen's Bureau. They were sharecroppers. They didn't earn wages, many of them. They worked year-long to raise a crop, and they simply were paid in shares of the crop. And of course, they were ritually cheated year in and year out. These contracts greatly depressed Black wages, so that Black families in the rural South in 1930 made 1/6 of what a Black family made in Chicago and 1/8 of what a Black family made in New York City. And given that, given racial violence, given the rise of the new Ku Klux Klan, supported by, of all people, President Woodrow Wilson. And also given the beginning collapse of Southern agriculture because of the boll weevil epidemic. African Americans were uneasy about their futures in the South. In addition, one of the things that happened was World War I. And while many went abroad in 1917 and 1918 to fight, to fight abroad, basically factories needed workers. And one big idea was to go down south and take train loads of Black farm workers and take them to the big cities, where overnight they changed from agricultural serfdom to an industrial proletariat. And that shift, also represented by great pride by those fighting in World War I, consciously going abroad to fight, to demonstrate heroism, to demonstrate patriotism, but to come back and demand a place at the table in America. All of this was sort of tied into the idea of the new Negro and what African Americans began to want. And I think also there was the notion that African Americans wanted alternative visions of themselves. And this is the time of, say, not only minstrelsy, but the birth of a nation, which on the one hand was technologically and technically a great film in terms of moving long film narratives forward, but on the other hand was overtly racist, based on The Klansman, a virulently racist novel by Thomas Dixon, which romanticized the plantation South and demonized African Americans and basically supported the Ku Klux Klan. There was a feeling among African Americans that there needed to be alternative visions of who Black people were and how they lived. And in fact, various people began to argue, various race leaders, we need competing images of Black life. There was the belief both that artistic production was a means by which African Americans, art was seen as the acme of culture, all right? The height of cultural achievement. And you still had many people who believed that African Americans could not create art comparable to others. That in many ways, for instance, people were even saying, oh, the Negro spirituals, they're just misheard Protestant hymns. They can't really write good poetry. They can't really write novels. They can't really write these things. So one, they wanted to be able to demonstrate that they could do it. But also, there's a long tradition in American literature of basically providing images of others as a means of broadening empathy and broadening social knowledge. There was also the idea that America itself had arrived not only economically and essentially was an empire, but also having contributed to the Allies' victory in World War I, was ready to emerge on the world stage. And in many ways, people were saying, what is our American literature? What will it be? Who will it present? What themes will it raise? And in many ways, African Americans raised their hands and said, yoo-hoo, the Negro spiritual is basically a foundational American music. The slave narrative is in many ways a uniquely American genre. African Americans and their lives are a unique part of America. And if you're going to conceive of an American classical music, you need to begin to look at ragtime and blues and jazz. If you're going to look at literature, you need to begin to look at Black lives and experiences as part of that literature. So as part of that, the question becomes, well, why Harlem? Okay, what's so important about Harlem? Harlem was significant in many reasons. It's not the only city, of course, in which African Americans went. The Black populations of cities was doubling, tripling, quadrupling, quintupling in the space of 5 years, right? The source of population growth in these cities was basically driven by Black in-migration, right? But Harlem stands out for a few reasons. First, because Harlem was kind of a new subdivision that fell into Black hands. I mean, not all of Harlem in northern Manhattan, but in about 1908, 1909, basically real estate developers overbuilt in that area of Manhattan. And then you had a depression. And these real estate developers were desperate. How do we get rid of this stuff? And enterprising white and Black realtors stepped in. And Black realtors said, we know of a lot of people who would pay a pretty penny to get a brand new house in a brand new development. And lo and behold, for the first time in American history, African Americans gained access to a brand new housing development, right? And again, it wasn't all of Harlem, but it was a few blocks, and gorgeous tree-lined streets, quality built homes, and so on and so forth. And accordingly, Harlem in many ways became the symbol of American opportunity for African Americans. It really symbolized Black modernity. To be able to arrive from the rural South and step into a modern, paved street, all the amenities, a modern urban community. But also, let's be honest, it was the home of major Black organizations, such as the NAACP, the country's oldest integrationist civil rights organization. The National Urban League had its headquarters in terms of business opportunities and development. And also the United Negro Improvement Association, Marcus Garvey's basically diasporic organization of Black uplift with its theme Back to Africa, with ultimately the dream of not only building up economic prowess throughout the entire Black diaspora, but ultimately to push imperialists out of Africa itself. These three prominent organizations had their headquarters in Harlem, but New York City was the cultural capital of the United States. at that point. The publishing industry had really, for the most part, not all of it, but a lot of it had moved to New York. And New York was a center of immigration. And in many ways, these publishing houses wanted new voices, diverse voices for a diverse readership. America also was just poised for interest in new voices as well. You had been building for years, not only a high school educated and then a smaller college educated readership that had moved largely out of agriculture into industry and service industries. You had a burgeoning readership ready to support publishing and interested in new voices and so on and so forth. All of that basically set the stage for the Harlem Renaissance. I've kind of mentioned that the Harlem Renaissance was a manufactured arts movement. While you had a generation of college-educated writers and young artists, some of whom were not college-educated, but would get training in the arts any way that they could. But in many ways, what began to develop in the 1920s, you had enterprising leaders such as Alain Locke, such as Charles Johnson, the editor of Opportunity, such as Jessie Fawcett, the literary editor of The Crisis, which was the NAACP's publication, who in many ways began to connect writers with patrons. And then they would sponsor contests. And then what they began doing is lining up enough patronage that they were actually calling upon artists and writers from across the country, saying, we just read your piece in this magazine. Come to Harlem. We've got a sofa you can stay on. We'll sort of set you up with some sort of patronage. We hear that you're kind of young, maybe interested in college. Maybe we can set you up with a scholarship. In many ways, they sent out the call around the country. Now, there were artists from around the country who did stay in place and do what they were doing. But in many cases, what happened is that there was this huge vacuum and this drawing upon intellectual and artistic talent, bringing it to New York, setting it up with various kinds of patrons, and really trying to get people's work in print, trying to get their work in galleries, and so on and so forth. Having said that, let me at least talk really briefly about some of the writers. I know we're going, it's like, here's a writer, but nevertheless, I'll be kind of quick. There are a whole series of writers, and I'm just going to name a few. There are many more that were very important, that were prominent. First of all, Langston Hughes. Hughes being very important, not only because really he's one of maybe two members of the Harlem Renaissance who sustained a writing career long past the Renaissance itself. 4 decades of writing in which he wrote in just about every genre, from poetry, for which he's probably arguably most famous, but novel, Not Without Laughter is a terrific novel written in the 1920s. 2 volumes of memoirs, The Big C and I Wonder as I Wander. He wrote the Simple newspaper column in which he represented the experiences of ordinary people. It was published in the Chicago Defender, but it was basically set in Harlem. And it's really later, but nevertheless, this is part of what he's doing. He's writing lyrics for Broadway shows, right? He's editing anthologies. And in many ways, Hughes was also an incredibly generous mentor to other writers. He was sometimes poo-pooed because he was a democratic poet, and he tried to write about modernist themes of cultural change and alienation, but wrote about it in a style that could be widely accessible to a great readership. And he was always very conscious about that. So a whole generation of Black writers after him kind of went, Langston Hughes, Ralph Ellison acknowledged his popularity, but oh, he wasn't the big thinker. Even James Baldwin didn't. But I think increasingly Hughes is seen as crucial in incorporating oral culture and tradition and popular culture into Black literature. And particularly, he is the poet laureate of Harlem, the unofficial poet laureate. He basically pioneered the blues poem and incorporation, and then later on bebop jazz basically shaped some of his poems. And Hughes also is influential in later writers because he insisted upon speaking to his readership through their own culture and representing these readers in their work. Jean Toomer is only kind of associated with the Harlem Renaissance, but he wrote one big book, an important book called Cain. Toomer was the descendant of basically important middle class African Americans in Washington, D.C., as you can tell, of complex racial background. But his book, Cain, which is a difficult book, was very, very influential, both because it got an important contract with a major publisher, but it's an experimental modernist book. It divided into 3 parts. It's not really a novel. It combines sketches and short stories, poems, and a closet drama at the end. A closet drama is a play that's not meant to be performed, but to be read. And what Toomer did was capture the richness, but also the historical trauma of the Black South. And also the problems of African Americans adjusting to the urban North. The second section deals with both Washington, D.C. and one story set in Chicago. But Toomer was very influential, but he himself moved on to other things and, was always very cagey about his racial identity. But, it's a difficult book, but it's a very, very important book. And it's a major book of American modernism. Jessie Fawcett is important. She was one of the most prolific novelists of the Harlem Renaissance, writing in many ways about Black pride, often from a sort of middle-class perspective. Many of her characters are middle class or aspire to the middle class, but in many ways also insisting upon their racial pride in the face of racial discrimination. But Fawcett is probably even more important as the literary editor of the Crisis, both because she discovered and published and fostered new talent, including Langston Hughes, among her discoveries, but also she edited the Brownies book. The Brownies book was the Crisis's sort of children's lit offshoot. So the Harlem Renaissance was not only interested in depictions of African Americans, they were interested in developing both a modern literature and a Black readership. And one way that you cultivate a Black readership or any kind of readership is to write for children. And this happens over and over and over. Caribbean writers, not only writing these great books for, audiences around the world, but they're also steadily writing children's literature to give images of characters to their own readers and to create a body of literature that can be taught in schools. And so Jessie Fawcett deserves a great deal of credit. Louisville's own County Cullen is very important here, though, there's a lot of mystery about his background, but he was likely born here and adopted by a Baptist minister in New York City, so ultimately raised in New York, but his early years were spent in Louisville, and it's impossible to find material about him here. So it's all very, very intriguing because, I mean, Louisville was maybe the 10th largest Black community in the United States, and pretty, a bit more progressive than cities farther south. But Cullen is significant because Cullen was sort of the embodiment of the dream of what a good Harlem Renaissance writer would be. He wrote in traditional form, and he is part of a wing of African-American writers, poets, that insist upon not seeing themselves solely as Black writers, even though they write about Black subjects, and he did. But he saw himself as part of a broader Western literary tradition, and he laid claim to that tradition. And in many ways, what he did was often modify, well, he writes sonnets, not only because he could, but he's not simply writing sonnets to demonstrate that he could write sonnets. He not only deeply understood the literary tradition, but in many ways, he felt that he was transforming that literary tradition by inserting himself and his own voice within it. So here he was, you know, I think Phi Beta Kappa Key at New York University, master's degree from Harvard University, and so on and so forth. He was sort of the more than Hughes. Hughes was popular, but a little bit of an embarrassment, you know, oh, he writes about trashy people going to speakeasies, you know. Yeah, this is Black bougie readers. Cullen, by comparison, was sort of the golden boy. But really it was Hughes who sustained his voice far beyond the Renaissance. But Cullen wrote some very important poetry. Zora Neale Hurston, though she wrote her books after the Renaissance, in many ways, she certainly came of age and developed her voice during the Harlem Renaissance with her published stories, and she was even writing plays. And Hurston is very important because she is sort of the fiction answer to Brown. I mean, not to Brown, to Hughes, Langston Hughes. Whereas Hughes celebrated basically, you know, sort of urban experience, Black urban experience. She became the voice of the rural South and insisted that Black folk traditions were already a rich cultural inheritance waiting to be drawn upon. They were already a source for a modern literature. There wasn't a need to go elsewhere or go to the cities and so on and so forth. And she was pushing against a tide because Hurston in many ways was, whereas many Black writers really felt, and intellectuals and scholars felt that Black folk culture, rural folk culture, they were embarrassed by it. And it was a cobbled together culture in the face of deprivation and slavery. But if anything, they felt, get rid of it, let it die out, and we're just going to march into modernity. Hurston was one of those writers who insisted, no, and because she was a trained anthropologist. She studied at Barnard with Franz Boas, the leading cultural anthropologist of his age. And anthropology richly infuses all of her writing. She has a perceptive eye and a wonderful ear for dialogue. And she always portrays characters, not simply individually, but within a rich cultural milieu, right? This, in many ways, was Hurston's gift. And her books from the 1930s certainly live on. Their Eyes Were Watching God is recognized as one of the great African-American novels. Mules and Men and her other anthropological studies are very influential. And they still are bringing out all of the literature that she wrote. She had the misfortune of getting into a fight, not physically, but intellectually with Richard Wright. Richard Wright became the dominant Black figure of the 30s and 40s. And in many ways, Hurston was pushed off to the side as a female writer and as seen as too conservative, not being strident enough. But now she's certainly recognized as one of the great American writers. Wallace Thurman from out west, I think from Salt Lake City, and then Los Angeles, and would come to New York, is very important because, one, he was a very talented writer who in some ways perhaps could never quite lived up to his talent. He was incredibly prolific. And probably his most famous novel is The Blacker the Berry, which is one of the frankest novels about colorism within the Black community. He also wrote Infants of the Spring, which is a satiric vision of the Harlem Renaissance itself, in a sense that the Harlem Renaissance never quite lived up to what it should have been. Nella Larsen wrote two of the great novels of the Harlem Renaissance, but was only recently rediscovered in the 80s and 90s. Zora Neale Hurston was forgotten until the 60s and 70s, and then gradually recovered by Alice Walker, by Robert Hemingway with his biography when he was at the University of Kentucky as a professor. Larson basically wrote two great novels, Quicksand and Passing, and in many ways writes, they're middle-class novels, but they're novels that also write about Black women's interiority and the complex in Black women basically navigating a world of sexism, racism, colorism, and so on and so forth. So both of these novels are two of the great psychological novels, and they're both short. They're incredibly rich, and I definitely recommend them. Now, there's significant figures. Alain Locke, and I've mentioned him before, basically a Harvard-trained philosopher, aesthetician, and he's important for a couple of reasons. Maybe three reasons. He also was influenced by the Harvard philosopher Horace Cullen with the idea of cultural pluralism, the belief that different ethnic groups could basically be left alone to sort of develop their own cultures, to control things within their own communities, but could basically work together as part of a broader whole. So in many ways, his philosophy was basically devoted toward improving race relations, among other things, but also the work that art could do in aiding this. So he was one of the great art theorists of his age, and very influential in terms of African-American visual art. And he called upon Black visual artists to basically look at draw upon African roots, because he was pointing out the modernists are doing it. Look at what Picasso's doing. Look at what all these artists are doing. If they can find something in their art, in Africa's artistic roots, surely African Americans could do so. But also he was in many ways a person who connected patrons to artists. Sadly, he was sexist. So more of that patronage tended to go to male artists than female artists. But Zora Neale Hurston, being cagey as everything, basically was able to get a fair amount of that herself. James Weldon Johnson is worth mentioning for a couple of reasons. He was the first Black General Secretary of the NAACP. He's a transitional figure in Black writing, a contemporary of Dunbar, who started out writing dialect poetry, and then he shifted away from that to begin to try to find alternative ways of creating a Black voice. He created one of the great anthologies of the Harlem Renaissance, the Book of American Negro Poetry. He also created the Book of Negro Spirituals, actually with his brother. And both of these collections are very, very important. The Book of American Negro Poetry is in two editions, 1922, 1931. And the 22 edition basically collects Black history and insists that there is a Black history to be celebrated. And it's this period of time in which anthologists, there are four major anthologies of African-American poetry, when there's a collection of Black documents, for instance, Arthur Schomburg in New York City, the Puerto Rican book collector of African descent, begins to amass a collection of manuscripts and documents and donates them to the New York Public Library, where we have the Schomburg collection today. And then Dorothy Porter at Howard University, basically creating the Moreland Spingarn collection. So Johnson is part of that in basically collecting and gathering together African-American literary history and making it available. And his 1931 edition of that anthology is important because it's a snapshot of the Harlem Renaissance itself. And Johnson was a great literary critic. His introductions, it's still a wonderful anthology to read, and I highly recommend it. But he also reprinted his important novel, The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, which talks about passing and the search for a Black identity and creating a Black identity. It was republished during the Harlem Renaissance, though it was published in 1912, and his wonderful collection, God's Trombones of 1927, I think it's 27, which is in trying to find a Black voice, they're free verse imitations of Black preachers. So incorporating the oral tradition, in this case, Black preachers into the tradition of Black preachers' rhetoric into African-American lit. I'm talking too much, so I need to get going a little bit. And let me at least mention one more. There we go. Charles Johnson. And Johnson is very important as the editor of Opportunity, which was the publication of the Urban League. And even more than the Crisis, the Opportunity became one of the leading publications for African-American writers during the Harlem Renaissance. He eventually would become a professor of social science at Fisk University. And I think he was Fisk University's first Black professor, or Black president. Sorry about that. Let me go, and I need to sort of tie up. You can tell I talk too long. I bore my students to death. But I wanted to mention art as well. And three important artists. Augusta Savage was one of the important sculptors of the Harlem Renaissance. And I probably need to really go speed up a little bit. But also she was important in trying to set up a school for Black artists in Harlem. In many ways sacrificed a great deal to increase Black artistic education. Richmond Bartay was also one of the great, God, he's handsome too, one of the great sculptors, and trying to represent both racial pride and a kind of cultural poise. Aaron Douglas is one of the great painters and muralists of the Harlem Renaissance, influenced, as you can tell, by African and even Egyptian art to try to represent at the same time a sense of modernity. And I didn't even get to music, which of course was very important, with performance venues such as the Cotton Club, which was Duke Ellington coming to New York City and performing there, but very problematic because of, and I'll stop sharing, very problematic, of course, because it was segregated. You had Black workers and entertainers and an all-white audience. But many speakeasies were places where African-American jazz was very prevalent in New York City. You also had Black folk culture, rent parties, because, obviously rents were sky high because Harlem was overcrowded and many places outside of Harlem wouldn't rent to African Americans. And that was generally true in many cities throughout the United States. So one way to raise the money would happen to be rent parties, and you would have alcohol, and you would have entertainment, and you would have dances, and you would have competitions and so on. And these became part of the tradition of Harlem itself. Harlem had many performance venues. So Harlem had its own nightlife and its own YMCA, and its own public library where, Nella Larsen was the children's librarian. In other words, it was a rich cultural place. Harlem, in many ways, the Harlem Renaissance came to an end primarily because of the Depression, the drying up of patronage, and the inability to really draw new artists into the Harlem Renaissance. Some of these artists died early. There was the brilliant novelist Rudolph Fisher, who probably wrote about Black life more than any other Harlem Renaissance writer, and he wrote 2 novels. Blanking on the names of them because, I'm 57. And he died of cancer. He was basically an X-ray specialist. And it's unclear if the X-rays themselves contributed to the cancer, but it was a tremendous loss. Many women were very active, but they stopped writing. And writers such as Gwendolyn Bennett, who was a talented artist as well, and Helene Thompson. Helene Thompson's sister, Dorothy West, would continue to write and published 2 novels, and was an editor in the Chicago Renaissance and so on and so forth. But in many ways, New York also, and the dream of New York died. Harlem ceased to be the model of what Black America could be, and it simply became the most famous and perhaps the largest Black community in America. But there was a sense in which opportunity died, both because African Americans still struggled to get jobs in New York City, and this was exacerbated by the Great Depression. The Great Depression destroyed Black businesses. Blaine Hudson, my colleague, and really a mentor to me at the University of Louisville, said that the 1920s was the golden age of Black business. And a lot of that was wiped out in the Great Depression. And many of these businesses didn't get New Deal support. The revision of the banking system really prevented communities from creating their own banks. So African Americans lost access to capital. And then many white businesses wouldn't hire African Americans, though they wanted their money. So whereas the national unemployment rate was 25%, in Black inner cities, it was 45 to 50%. And in fact, this tension and this anger led to 2 great explosions in Harlem, one in 1935 and one in 1943. And these were significant because up until that time, race riots had largely been armed attacks on Black communities for decades. The most famous, there were numerous of them, but 1935 and 1943 were significant because they were spontaneous explosions of frustration, of anger within the communities itself. It was the birth of the modern race riot, all because of the frustration of what was happening in these cities. They had been sources of dreams and they weren't. And what you eventually get is things such as, but this doesn't completely dry up. Younger writers like Sterling Brown celebrate Black folk culture in his book, Southern Road. And then he turns to literary criticism. and he becomes the leading cultural sort of intellectual, Black cultural intellectual in mid-century, and teaches generations of Howard University students. You have the foundation of Black art departments throughout the South. So many trained artists to make money, they went into teaching, but they trained the next generation of Black artists. You have, so in other cities became very important destinations of art, probably most notably Chicago. Chicago in the 1920s through the 1950s is eventually going to give New York a run for its money. Blues musicians and jazz musicians coming up north via the railroads and settling in Chicago make Chicago the destination for urban blues, one of the destinations for jazz. Louis Armstrong cuts many of his really influential early jazz sides before moving to Chicago. He cuts them in Chicago. Before moving on to New York. Gospel music develops in Chicago. And you get writers such as Richard Wright, Gwendolyn Brooks, Lorraine Hansberry a little bit later. So in other words, Harlem doesn't disappear either. Whereas County Cullen basically teaches high school, one of his students is James Baldwin. Ralph Ellison moves to New York and writes about the experience of New York in Invisible Man. New York doesn't go away as a cultural center at all, but other places become cultural centers as well. And this will be even more important in the 1960s with the Black Arts movement, where you don't have one location in, say, New York. And admittedly, there were other conglomerations in the 20s, but you have New York and Newark and Chicago and LA and New Orleans, and you get it. But anyway, that's at least a sort of introduction to the Harlem Renaissance. I'm kind of, hopefully that, and I'm just skimming the surface, but it's well worth exploring what you might think about, what you might do.